Fascinating guest for you guys coming up now. All right, Amanda Edwards joins me. She's a U.S. Senate candidate in the state of Texas, running as John Coryn, but also running in a primary. Amanda, welcome to the Young Turks.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Oh, no problem. So you're currently a Houston City Council member as well, right?
I have been a Houston City Council member. I actually just left my seat to pursue this journey full time as trying to become the next United States Senator. It's no small feat at all.
No, not at all. And you went to Emory University and then Harvard Law School, so some great credentials. But we've also interviewed several other people in this Democratic primary. So Amanda, for the audience, what do you think distinguishes you from them and why you should be the Democratic nominee?
I think my why is one distinguishing factor, which happens to be that I believe that all people, no matter where they're from, deserve real results in their lives. I've watched time and time again that people on the campaign trail make promises that, quite frankly, they don't keep. And I think that ends up eroding democracy. And people need us to go into these jobs, these offices, and to do the work that we say we're going to do and actually deliver on that work so that their lives can be different. When we saw the 2018 election cycle happen in Texas and Beto get within 215,000 votes of winning, one of the things that was striking to me also were with some of the lessons learned. So, for example, he did very well with persuadable voters, but in communities of color, there were high registration levels, but the turnout was not quite as high. It was under 50% of the registered numbers. Same thing held true with people under the age of 35. And so I believe that a lot of the time when communities stay at home, when they've registered to vote, there is a disconnect about whether or not it's going to really matter in their lives. And because of the fact that they haven't, or they don't believe that they've seen it work or democracy work for them. And so having a messenger like me, who not only is someone who's passionate about change, but who has delivered change and results for the people she has served, I think will be the right candidate to be able to unseat John Coryn in this very critical election cycle.
So I'm sorry, Amanda, maybe I read the articles wrong back in the day. So when Beto ran for Senate, you're saying people under 35 showed up less and there was less voter turnout than normal? Because I thought I'd read the opposite.
The register, it's comparing to the registered number. So when he had high numbers of registered voters, and for both communities of color as well as people under the age of 35. The statistic that I was highlighting to you was that in both of those populations, less than 50% of the registered voters in that population turned out to vote.
Okay, so we could still do better. Okay, I just wanted to make sure I understood. Yes.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, that totally makes sense. All right.
Like, because there's a demonstrated interest in voting by virtue of the registration.
Yep.
But in terms of who actually turned out to vote, there's a gap that if we could actually get that gap filled or addressed, we will be able to have the votes necessary in order to win against John Coryn, who in fact is actually very vulnerable right now. Many people don't realize, since I've been in the running against him, he's been polling between 27% approval and 35% approval, which is quite low for someone who's been in office since 2003.
No, that's not quite low. That's miserably low. So yeah, like the Republican Party has no idea what kind of trouble they're in. McConnell also polls around 35% in his home state of Kentucky. So politically speaking, it might be a bloodbath for him in 2020. It's going to be fascinating to see. So I'm glad we clarified the point earlier. I understand what you're saying now. Now there was something else you said. You said some people promise things that they can't deliver. I was curious what you meant by that. What's that a reference to?
Absolutely. I think every single time, as someone who has served in government and served closely with the people, every single time we open our mouths, you have an opportunity to restore confidence in government or to further erode it. And when we don't deliver on the things that we say, a lot of these communities are used to people showing up for the vote, but they don't show up and actually deliver. I'm going to give you an anecdote. Right after Harvey happened, 51 inches of rainfall fell across our community. And I went and checked on some of my lower income senior citizens, going just to, stopping by, visiting them and asking them how they were getting their furniture removed, et cetera. But when I'd asked them how they were going to clean out or remove the walls that had been soiled by the floodwaters, their response was that those walls had already dried. Of course, as you might assume, you can't allow walls that have been soiled by floodwater to remain in the home. Otherwise, you're going to have mold to set in. So, of course, that was heartbreaking, but I wasn't elected to be heartbroken. I was elected to do something. So I mobilized hundreds of volunteers to go out door to door, check on some of these seniors. Well, the interesting fact of me bringing this up was when I'd step foot on those doorsteps and I'd wear my government shirt so they know I was here on behalf of the government versus actually being there to scam them or something else. The first thing people would ask was, are you up for re-election? Because it baffled them that they would see an elected official standing on their doorstep needing something else for any other reason other than a vote. And I was actually there to deposit into their lives, which is a paradigm that we should be perpetuating and promoting, as opposed to the typical, which is that people come around election time, they make promises that they don't keep, and then they come back that same next election time, and those communities continue to have their faith in democracy eroded because they're not seeing the results. They see the people when it's time for a vote from them. And that's what I think is very exploitative, quite frankly. And I think we have to work against that with people who can be effective in office.
Okay, again, I totally agree with that. All right, so let's go to policy. Let's take healthcare. That's obviously a pressing one across the country and certainly in Texas. First on your list as well. What's your proposal for that?
I think we expand the number of Americans that are covered and who have access to health care by improving upon the Affordable Care Act in the following ways. First, we should, as it was originally intended, have a public option. An affordable public option should have been part of the Affordable Care Act. I don't think they had the political ability to get it done, but I think now the country is in a different space and place, and so we need to incorporate having a public option. The second is to make sure that we have transparency in billing, that we have predictable insured pools, such that we start to drive some of the premium costs down. If you recall, after the Affordable Care Act passed, that was one of the chief complaints, was the premiums going up or when people couldn't keep their doctors. And so having that option for those that need a public option, that employer-based coverage does not work or is not appropriate for them, then they have an option that is actually appealing. Also making sure that people who want to keep employer-based insurance, don't want to switch doctors, all of those things, have that option as well. I think those two, having the optionality there, kind of addresses the cost of just having a single payer system being too big in terms of cost. But at the same time, it gets you where you need to go, which is tailoring it to the people who want it or need it. And I think that's the best approach. Also, driving the cost of prescription drug costs down. That's critically important. I have interviewed and talked to people who ration their prescription drugs. That's untenable in today's society. It should not be going on in America. Finally, also closing some of the loopholes that have been expanded under the Trump administration, such as short-term insurance. We've got to close those loopholes so that people are not underinsured, which means that you've paid into a system that you think will provide you one thing and realize that you're really left empty-handed.
Yeah, so that point about the uninsured also totally correct. Amanda, oftentimes it's public option versus Medicare for all and in the national discourse, and I think there's good reason for that. I think those are the two proposals put forward by different wings of the Democratic Party. But I want to ask you the question in a slightly different way. So let's say that you win, you get into the Senate, and you guys vote on public option first, and great, it passes. So that's a wonderful day in America. Then you've got a Democratic Party, progressives have a lot of momentum. Medicare for all comes up for a vote afterwards. And you're the critical vote. You will decide whether it passes or not. Do you vote yes on it?
I think it depends on what is going to be the price tag and how we actually pay for it. I think right now there's been a lot of schools of thoughts. about what the price tag actually looks like. In theory and in principle, certainly you want to have as many people covered as possible. Let me give you an example. My father was diagnosed with cancer when I was 10 years old, and he died when I was 17. So in our household, I learned what access to healthcare coverage was by virtue of asking my dad if he was going to have coverage for his treatments. And so I understand it's a life and death issue for people. I think one of the things we have to make sure of, though, is that it's something that as a nation we have full information. I think it's our job as leaders to make sure that people are fully informed and are making informed choices. But then also it's something that we can sustain. So I think that's been kind of part of the open question, is the sustainability of a Medicare for all system. And so I know that some of the presidential candidates have proffered ways in which you pay for it through various forms of taxation. I think there's been some jockeying of numbers of what that really looks like. And so I'd have to evaluate it based on what the numbers really are. We know that during campaign season, the campaigns themselves have their viewpoints on how something like this might be or turn out versus what ultimately the measure is before you, and it's been fully analyzed and evaluated.
Okay, so Amanda, unfortunately we're out of time. I wish we had a chance to discuss that more because it's such an interesting topic, and we would actually have some significant disagreement about that, so that'd be an interesting conversation. And we didn't get to all the other policies, but I did want to ask you mentioned the presidential candidates. Is there one that, again, the audience understands where you stand. Is there one that you're more similar to or have endorsed or are backing as opposed to the others?
No, I have not endorsed any of the candidates. I actually am trying to make up my mind, like a lot of Americans are at this point. Certainly, we have a strong field. I think it's unfortunate that it's lost its diversity. I think it was interesting to see that debate stage lose the diversity in the last round. And I think that now, hopefully going forward, that will be an expectation, is that we have diversity, not in terms of just race, but also gender. So I'm glad to see that there are women candidates still in this race and still taking a prominent role in terms of this running, because at one point that was not something that one would expect. And so I think these are positive strides, but as far as making up my mind or endorsing a particular candidate, I'm in that process just like a lot of Americans are as we speak.
Okay, so everybody, the website is amandafortexas.com, amandafortexas.com. It's a way to donate and volunteer, which we always put up at the end of the interviews, and we'll have the links down below if you're watching later on YouTube and Facebook as well. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to ask one other question, Amanda. Do you take corporate PAC contributions?
We have taken some corporate PAC contributions, but a minimal amount. The basis for that isn't that we have any intent to have any influence or undue-influence by corporate PACs. The truth of the matter is I have a record that actually speaks counter to that, in that it's unethical to allow your votes or your decision making when you take an oath of office, to be influenced by monetary means. I think that is completely inappropriate, improper, and counter to my ethics and my standards. And so I have never allowed my votes to be swayed in any particular way. In fact, I've voted against some of the checks I've received in the past in terms of their interests, because it was not in the interest of the public. And I will continue to think about what is the interest of the public, no matter who has supported my campaign financially. So whether it's in a form of a PAC or an individual, no one should be able to put money in your hands and expect you to vote in a particular way.
Okay, again, amandafortexas.com. I'm so glad that we've had so many different candidates on so folks can see for themselves. I don't make these decisions anymore around here, but I would love it if you guys came and debated for the Democratic primary, because I think that race is infinitely interesting.
It is. And I'm glad it's healthy for democracy to have choices and to have a breadth of candidates in the way that we do. Now, maybe it's not normal to have 12 of us.
Well, you'd be surprised. There's some races like that.
But having a competitive primary certainly is healthy, particularly in a state like Texas.
Right. All right, Amanda Edwards, thank you so much for joining us on the Young Turks. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
On the go? Don't worry, we got you covered. You can still listen to TYT at our new podcast network. Find us on Apple Podcasts, the Google Play Store, or at tyt.com/podcast.